All right, guys, welcome everyone to our second Learn and Explore talk here at Nikon Canada for 2019. Tonight's talk is going to be on sports photography, and it was billed as a beginner's introductory into sports photography. If you guys really are just beginning your journey into maybe picking up an SLR, a telephoto lens for the first time, graduating from a cell phone, or just might be coming from out of your comfort zone. You might be used to taking landscape photography and all this dynamic action and capturing the moments and things, fleeting moments like that are a little bit new to you, and you want to kind of get to know what are the best practices. That's what I'm going to go through for the next 30 minutes, okay? It's going to be nice and light, not too technical like I usually am, but we're just going to go through some basic concepts on how to get better sports photographs. Now, I'm just gonna tackle what a lot of you might be thinking right off the bat is the challenges in your sports photography if you've tried shooting sports before, or action in general for that matter. There usually is challenges if you're coming from point and shoot cameras, if you're coming from smartphones, and maybe even older SLR cameras having to do with such things as image quality, okay? Lighting, freezing the action, maybe even color. And these are usually the things that I hear from people. My photos, they look maybe too dark, okay? You might have heard that a bit. Or my photos look a little bit blurry. Let's just tackle those two things right off the bat. I mean, a lot of those things can really be just fixed with shutter speed. That's the number one thing to make your photos sharper. And proper focus, okay? So proper focus means using the proper autofocus modes as well as the proper lenses to capture the detail that you want. But let's first talk about image quality. And one of the reasons you might want to invest in a SLR camera, for example, or even a mirrorless camera with a telephoto lens, is that not only are you getting better image quality through the larger sensor, but you're actually getting better image quality through glass that'll render the detail that you wouldn't normally get through a tiny lens on a smartphone, which covers an even tinier sensor behind it, okay? So what you're really looking at on your phone when you're scrolling through your feed and looking at other people's pictures is a small representation of what that picture looks like. When you actually bring it up on your 27-inch iMac at home or your TV or whatnot, the detail is usually lacking. And that's where people kind of realize that their images on their smartphones are good from afar, but far from good. Is that fair to say? So, I mean, this is just something that I did myself, you know, using an SLR and shooting the same scene from a smartphone. A lot of people will utilize the pinch zoom on their phone, and I just saw someone cringe there, like, that's exactly what I do too when I see people pinch and zoom. But, you know, a lot of people don't know any better. They actually think that it's magnifying the image, when in actual fact, it's only digitally zooming in, and you lose a lot of quality in that. So, I mean, a smartphone picture wouldn't ordinarily look this bad when you take it straight out of the phone, but it gets exponentially worse once you pinch and zoom. So be very careful with that. Typically, a smartphone will only have one lens, and you'll have to physically walk closer to your subject in order to fill the frame and get more detail. Whereas, if you have a zoom lens, you can be in one spot and magnify that image without losing quality. So that is really the secret in getting better sports photography, is getting better glass to go in front of your camera. Okay, that's step number one. And usually you want to be in the 200 to 300 millimeter range for starters, okay? And the other thing that I say, in addition to the image quality, is also the color. Okay, so the colors that are rendered through an SLR are usually a little bit more sophisticated metering systems. So it recognizes artificial lighting, and usually it can correct that lighting a whole lot better than smartphone technology at this point. Okay, so those are the things you can do. And to be quite honest with you, I don't even rely on the auto white balance in the SLRs. A lot of the time, I set it myself. So I'll either balance off of the ice if it's, you know, pure white, or the ground if it's gray, or custom balance my white balance, something that is very rare feature found in a smartphone. It's very rare for you to be able to customize your white balance to the level of precision that I'm able to do with an SLR camera. So if you have a Nikon camera, look for the PRE setting in your white balance. That's usually the last setting. If your camera has that, that means you can have a preset white balance and you can meter off of, say, a gray card or even just something like a white wall and neutralize all your lighting and keep it consistent from shot to shot. That's what I do on every one of my shoots when I take a picture of my son in an arena or something of that matter. Now, let's just talk about something in terms of choosing the right gear, okay? The right gear is really important, as I mentioned, shooting with telephoto lenses and such, but Nikon has about 90 different lenses in their lineup right now. Even if you're not using Nikon, you might be using another brand. There's a lot of different options out there. What is the proper lens for you to get? Well, can a lens be, too big, all right? Too big, too long, and things like that? No, it doesn't exist. For me, the bigger the better, all right? So I'm rocking around a 500 millimeter f4 all day long. Isn't that right, Kendall? Yes, she nods. Okay. And to me, you can never have too big a lens, okay? You might have too small arms, but you can never have too big a lens. You can use a tripod and monopod if you want, but to me, if I'm shooting sports from the sidelines, especially of a big soccer field or a stadium of that nature, having the larger lens makes it a difference when trying to get better quality. It lets more light in and I get closer to the action, okay? Now, having said that, this is a $14,000 lens, and I don't actually own this lens. Lyssandra's nice enough when I treat her nicely to borrow that every so often. But I won't talk about all the lenses out there. I will talk about a couple, okay? Where would I go if I were to start right now and use a telephoto lens? No matter what camera I had in the Nikon lineup, I would probably look, first of all, to a 70-300. And good news for Nikon users is that they just refreshed this lens, probably in the last 18 to 24 months, okay? It's a brand new 70-300. The one before that was several years old. This has now all the newest technology in it. It's the fastest focusing 70-300 that we have. And that goes for $799 in Canada. So whether you're using a D5000 series or a D7000 series or full frame, this will fit it. So if you right now are using a D3400 and in the future you say I want to use a D750, I might go full frame in the future, I might vacillate between the two formats. Maybe I own both a DX and an FX camera. You can use this interchangeably between both, okay? Now, if you want to save a couple of $100, maybe $270, and also save on the size and weight, there is another version of this lens that's also called the 70-300, but it's only dedicated for the DX format. So this one here it'll say $529 on our website, but you can actually find this a lot with dual lens kits. So when you go somewhere and buy an entry-level kit like a D5300 or a D3500, a lot of times you can buy the 18-55 as well as the 70-300. Usually on Black Friday, Boxing Day, there are big specials on this, but any time of the year you can usually get this type of lens, and it's very, very effective in capturing almost all sports where you have to sit far away from the sidelines. It's very light and it's very fast focusing. So especially when you're talking about things that are moving fast, you want to make sure that you have the proper glass, and good news is these lenses are only a couple of years old, so they're basically cutting edge technology. This is for the F mount, by the way. You could also use it on a Z6 or a Z7 with the adapter, okay? So those are the two general lenses that I would basically start off with. They are a 4.5/5.6, and in this case a 4.5 to 6.3, but if you're taking pictures outdoor, that's plenty of light to come into the camera and stop the action. Now let's talk a little bit about settings here, okay? So if you already have a SLR, no matter what the SLR, well, let's just talk about anything that's D3000, 5000, or 7000 series. You might be familiar with a dial at the top of the camera like this. This dial represents some preset modes in the camera. Out of the box, by default, it'll usually be on the green mode. Now, usually what happens when people take the camera out of the box, they want to keep it on the green mode because the green mode essentially does everything, all right? But one thing that it does that you don't want it to do is in dark situations, it pops up that pop-up flash, okay? A lot of times it will balance the aperture and the shutter speed and make the aperture a little bit closed if it finds there's an ample amount of light, okay? Whereas typically in sports photography, what you want to do is you want to max out the shutter speed as much as you can so you can stop the action, which is why I abandoned the green mode. As a matter of fact, I abandoned the no flash mode. But if you want to pick up the camera and kind of set it and forget it, one mode that I would recommend is there's actually a sports mode on these cameras. So there's a sports mode, a running man. So if you see that at the bottom right there, that'll put your camera in essentially most of the settings that would give you success in a sports type of scenario, okay? So if you kind of just want to worry about composition, you want to worry about just capturing the action and don't want to necessarily fiddle around with your shutter speed, aperture, all these, or your autofocus and all these sort of things, this starts you in the best position to just get comfortable with starting to capture fast action, okay? So that's what I would suggest as a starter, and a lot of cameras have that option. But no matter what camera you're using, if you want to start getting into the nitty-gritty, AFC is a must, okay? So there's really only two autofocus modes on the camera. There's AFS and AFC. So AFS stands for single servo autofocus, meaning to say you focus on something and it stops there, okay? In order to focus again, you have to let go of the shutter release and press it again, okay? Which is problematic when you get into situations where things are coming at you at a high rate of speed. Even if people were running or even walking towards you, it's not ideal to use AFS, which is why for 99% of sports photography, you want to leave it on the AFC mode, autofocus continuous, meaning to say as long as you're pressing down on the shutter release, it's going to be focusing right up until you take the photo, okay? So find that on your camera. It might be in a menu, it might be a physical button on the side of the camera. If you have a D7000 series, it's usually on the side of the camera. If you have a 5000 or 3000 series, it's in the menus. So you want to find it there, okay? But this, again, is something that the smartphone pretty much cannot do. And even, I would say, point and shoots struggle with. It's typically the modules found in SLR, the autofocus modules, that are very, very good at capturing fast and dynamic moving subjects, such as a cyclist, okay, which is coming around a corner very, very fast, all right? So look for that in your menus. Now let's just talk about some basic things when you're shooting, such as basic composition, okay? Whether you're shooting landscapes or portraiture or whatever type of genre of photography, a lot of times you want to think about first and foremost composition. You know, you learn about rule of thirds. And it seems that when you're shooting in sports, you're just trying to capture the moment so quickly that you just line it up with the center and hope for the best, right? But as you get more comfortable with your shots and trying to take interesting photos, you might want to think about composing them in such a way that maybe aligns with the rule of thirds, okay? So this is a shot donated by my good friend out in Vancouver, Rob Sturgis, and he does these compositions where it's a little bit off-center, you know, kind of like with the rule of thirds, aligning with the intersection of those points there, and it adds a little bit of visual interest. He's very good at, you know, leading the eye and things like this. And this is where your autofocus points come into play. We were talking about autofocus servo, the way the lens behaves in terms of continuously focusing or stopping while it focuses. Here, you want to compose, but if your autofocus point is dead center, it's going to focus on the background. If your subject is off to the left or right, this is where you have to start getting familiar with the different autofocus arrays on your specific camera. And again, on a smartphone, it's usually trying to capture whatever's closest. It may not be so sophisticated as on to lock on into a certain subject at a certain portion of the frame. So if your camera currently doesn't do this, you just have to find the mode that allows you to manipulate the autofocus points one by one. And that's the key to getting better compositions in anything, not just sports photography, but portraiture, product photography, anything, when you want to isolate that subject from the background, okay? Also work on, again, not necessarily shooting always telephoto, but think about shooting wide-angle lenses too. You know, the beauty about having interchangeable lens cameras, mirrorless cameras, SLR cameras, is that you can take off that that telephoto lens and put on something a little bit more wide to change your composition. Sports, you know, with how much energy it has, the movement, the dynamic nature of sports doesn't necessarily have to be seen down the lens of a 300 millimeter focal length, okay? You can open it up as well. So think about your composition before you start getting into the nitty-gritty of all these different focus modes. Of course, you want to get it rock sharp with your focus, but you also want to keep your composition in mind as you do that too. Now, speaking about other tips and tricks that I would recommend, I would also encourage you to know the sport that you're photographing as well, okay? A lot of us might be shooting sports because our kids are involved in sports. You might be doing it as a profession. You might be doing it for the love of that particular sport, okay? In my case, I have a few kids that are involved in sports, and I usually do it just because I want to document the things that they're doing. But I also, in order to do that effectively, I kind of have to know that sport well. So, for example, when my son was playing baseball here, I mean, it's pretty simple. There's only 3 things that they do in that sport. They hit, they run, and they catch and throw, okay? So you're trying to anticipate when those things are going to happen because ultimately you want to capture peak of action moments, okay? So, you know when they're going to hit, you know generally when they're going to run, but, there are other times in the game where you want to anticipate some peak of action too. So for me, I love baseball, so a lot of times I would look towards a pickoff attempt at first base, okay? These shots here were taken by my good friend Rob Bagliolid from Bell Art in Hamilton, and his son plays at a high level of baseball here, so he's always traveling around with his D500 as well as his 200 to 500 millimeter lens. It gives him a good versatility, and if you're looking for a really versatile setup, the DX format gives you that because every lens that you attach to a smaller sensor, such as a D500, D7500, or even D3500 for that matter, you actually multiply it by 1.5, okay? So a 300 millimeter lens is really the equivalent of a 450, okay? A 100 millimeter lens would really be the equivalent of a 150. So that's one of the reasons why people like shooting the smaller sensor format, specifically for sports, because it allows them to get closer to the action without having to buy a more expensive and bigger lens, okay? Whereas full-frame lenses, you have no choice. You actually have to buy the bigger lenses, the 200 to 500s, to get closer to the action. So again, know your sport, anticipate the action because those make the best pictures, okay? There's a energy here. You're capturing a lot. There's a lot happening in this photo, but it's better than them just being static and standing still. It adds a little interest to the photo. Also, if you know the game, you know when a play is going to be made, you might want to anticipate where the play is going to be. And it's hard sometimes in games like football, baseball, hockey, where plays are happening all over the place. But, for example, in baseball, there's a runner on second base, there's a base hit. You might not necessarily be following where the ball is, you might be anticipating where the ball is going to be, okay? So in the case of baseball here, if there's a play at the plate, and you know that there's going to be a play at the plate or a play at a specific base, you may want to pre-focus on that plane so that you don't miss that opportunity when it arises. And when I say pre-focus, that means before the action actually happens, focus your camera or your lens on that particular plane, and then when the action happens there, all you have to do is fire off the shot. So a lot of times what photographers do, particularly in fast-moving sports like skiing, for example, they will pre-focus on a spot, turn off the autofocus, and just blast away at that point where the action happens. Again, this is something that SLRs do very good, not only because it has a continuous drive mode, anywhere from 6 to 12 frames per second, but also the response time of an SLR is very, very fast. There's virtually no lag. So when things like this happens, I rarely shoot in continuous drive mode anymore because I'm shooting D5, D850, and even D7500. These cameras are very responsive when you press the shutter release. So a lot of times I'm good, just one shot at a time, and that's the beauty of SLR, okay? So anticipate your action points, pre-focus, and you'll find that you're gonna get better shots because you're taking them at the action points. Now, other things you can do also is just change your angle. physically move your body to other points of the arena or the stadium. In the case of baseball, for example, it's very easy to set up in one spot and just take the same picture over and over. But once you've exhausted those positions, maybe change it around. So move from maybe the right to the left, even if it's the same picture, but you'll get another angle of them. Think about your composition as well. So this shot could have easily been like this, omitting the batter, but when you include the batter in there, it adds a little bit of context, a little depth, and it actually draws your eye towards the subject, okay? It gives a point of reference. You ever see people take pictures of the moon whenever there's the blood moon, right? You go through your feed, and it's just moonshot after moonshot after moonshot after moonshot with just a black background. That's it. But the more interesting shots are the ones where it puts the moon into context. There is something in the foreground, a tree, a building. So you take the picture with the angle low, and you can actually put your subject into a better point of interest, such as a picture like this. Now, a picture like this, if you're shooting amateur sports, we're not always privy to a hole in the glass or a hole in the fence or anything like that. We often have to deal with shooting through barriers, to keep the spectators safe. In the case of baseball, you're shooting through a fence. So this is one of the reasons why you want to have a telephoto lens, because a telephoto lens will blur that cage, for example. If you're using a wide-angle lens and you go right up to the cage, even right up to the cage, you're still going to get the fence in there, okay? Cell phone, the same thing. Smartphones, for that matter, don't have a very big sensor, and thus the aperture can't be very wide and the depth of field can't be very shallow, and thus you'll capture a lot of the foreground. So this is the advantage of having a telephoto lens, because you can literally obliterate the foreground by having a super telephoto lens. It doesn't even have to have a wide aperture. As long as you're zoomed out to 200 or 300, even if it's a 5/6 lens, you can actually obliterate anything that's within the minimum focusing distance of that lens a lot of times, okay? So that's why a 70 to 300 is really important in your arsenal, okay? Again, if you're shooting amateur sports, that's what you're going to be dealing with, because not everybody can be on, the press pit in the Blue Jays Stadium. But again, look for points of interest, especially with the players where you can see their eyes, okay, and things like that. Usually when you see Marcus Stroman pitching in the game, it's very quick. It's only a matter of 3/4 of a second that he pitches the ball. And that's the beauty of sports, is that in that 1/8,000th of a second, you can capture their posture, their form, and the look in their eyes and things like this. This is what I love about sports photography, is that it captures the moments you don't see in video. You don't see this type of thing on TV. You only see them in still pictures, okay? Now let's talk about cropping here when necessary. So when I'm learning how to shoot, and when you're all learning how to shoot, I encourage you to what they call shooting a little bit loose, okay? Some people more pro photographers might scoff at that. I know a couple of pro photographers scoffed at some of my photos. Oh, you guys shoot loose, right? Because typically as you get more experienced, you're so experienced you can anticipate the action, so you're very, very tight on your composition, because when you take that picture, it's almost framed exactly as you want it. But as you're learning, okay, I would probably encourage you to shoot a little bit wider, okay? And the reason being, the cameras nowadays at 24 megapixels, 36, 46 megapixels, there's a lot of forgiveness in these cameras. And with the resolution of the lenses, I mean, you can crop in, and that picture doesn't even look like it's cropped, right, at all. It looks like you framed the photo that way right out of the camera. But with digital cameras nowadays, the forgiveness is very, very high. You can get those type of shots anytime when you crop, even more drastically than that. I'll tell you, a lot of the professional photographers out there shooting sports, they crop almost every finished photo that they publish in the newspapers. So don't be afraid to crop, and that, for that matter, don't be afraid to shoot a little bit more loose to give yourself a little bit more freedom in composition, okay? Speaking of that, I just wanted to take this opportunity to mention something that I like in higher end lenses. I know I mentioned the two more accessible lenses, the 70 to 300. But if you're thinking about doing this thing a little bit more seriously in the future, there are a number of Nikon lenses that allow you to pre-focus certain focal planes. So for example, if there's going to be a play at second base and there's going to be, the runner stealing, the very real risk that you run in a big field like this with a far away background is if you miss that play with your single focus point, it will shoot to the fence. And at that point, it will obliterate all plane of focus where your action was, okay? So to help avoid this, on some of the Nikon lenses, such as the 180 to 400 and some of our other super telephotos, it comes with a memory set button. And that memory set button allows you to pre-program focal planes. This actually comes in handy a lot with wildlife photography when a bird is perched on a branch and you're taking pictures in the foreground and background, and when that bird eventually lands there, all you want to do is be able to swing your camera around, and instead of having to worry about nailing the autofocus, all you're worried about is composition. Make sure it's somewhere in the frame, okay, because this action happens really, really fast. So if you're the type of person that's, taking this sports photography to the next level, know that there are several Nikon lenses that have a programmable memory set point. So you could memorize that point all by hitting a revert button on the lens, and it's not actually autofocusing, it's just anchoring the lens back to that focal plane. So all you have to do is bang, 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 and shoot, okay? Now, I mentioned peak of action, so I just want to harp on this again in terms of when you take the photo, because the temptation in when you buy a D7500 that shoots at 8 frames a second is the first thing I got to do with my camera is put it on the CH mode, right? The CH, which is the blast, 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 in 1 second take 8 frames. Multiply that by how many seconds in a quarter, how many minutes and a half, and how many hours in a game, and you walk home with 1,000 pictures, okay? Where in reality, all you really wanted was the peak of action moments, okay? So having said that, if I go, I'm showing a lot of baseball pictures here, but this applies to any sport, okay? In terms of baseball, a lot of the moments are them just standing at the plate, right? Waiting for that pitch to come in. But maybe what you want to look for as well is those moments where they're actually going for the ball. So that's the money shots that you want to get there, the peak of action where they're actually putting some effort into hitting something, headbutting something, kicking the ball, doing a header, tripping someone, okay? All these apply to both professional sports photography, which all of these are. These were taken by a professional sports photographer, Jeff Chevrier, here in Mississauga. So he goes out to all of these professional sporting events. But these can be applied to the amateur sports photographer, whether you're the soccer mom or dad like me from a couple of years ago. I apply the same concepts. Look for the peak action, okay? The point where they're going to engage one another. And you can anticipate that the more you kind of study and appreciate the sport and things like that. And to achieve, again, these type of moments, you want to be on AFC, autofocus, and I would also probably encourage you to entertain something called back button autofocusing. So has anybody heard of back button autofocusing? Okay, good. Now, most cameras will already have a back button. So it's not a matter of reprogramming that button to autofocus. Some of them you might have to, because it'll only have an AEL button at the back. You might have to reprogram that to autofocus. But if you already have, say, a D850, okay, to achieve back button focus, you have to actually deactivate the shutter release from focusing, okay? And that's found in the custom settings menu. And by doing that, you essentially no longer have to switch between AFS and AFC. You can leave it on AFC 100% of the time. Because what back button focusing does is it allows you to do continuous focusing when you want to, and then when you find your plane of focus and you don't want it to move anymore, simply let go of your thumb, the back button, and then just fire away on the shutter release, okay? Most cameras in our lineup can do this. All you have to do is find it in the custom settings menu, okay? And it's usually under an option called AF activation on, or, and that'll be in the section A in the custom settings menu, okay? So autofocus continuous. Again, look for peak of action no matter what the sport is. Hockey is very easy to find peak of action because There's always action happening in hockey. In baseball, it's a little harder because there's a lot of dead time, but you know if you can anticipate when things are going to happen. And I'll just stop it here for a second because I want to talk about what shutter speeds you would use to capture a ball and see the seams, okay? You really need to be above 1/2000th of a second. Most cameras will go up to 1/4000th or 1/8000th of a second, but if you're any less than 1/2000th of a second, you're not going to get that level of detail. The good news is when you're taking pictures out in soccer games, baseball games are usually outdoor in the bright sunlight, so you have ample light. And even if you're using a slower lens like a 70-300 at 6.3, or you want to get a little bit more depth of field and you want to close it down to f8 or maybe even f11, the ISO on your cameras right now, you can crank it up to 1600, okay, and still speed up your shutter speed, okay? So nowadays it's very easy to put it up to 1600 ISO. I know Tony Beck never did that, right? And hi, Tony. He's a purist, so everything's down to 800 ISO for him. But I tell you, I shoot these cameras now at 6400 ISO without any guilt, 12,800 in the cases of a D5, even higher than that, really. And again, with the type of quality coming out, and especially in daylight, it's good at hiding the noise. You're going to get that type of detail. Okay. Just a couple more shots here of from my friend Jeff Chevrier. And again, some things you will, I kind of said, don't necessarily use the continuous high-speed release, but there are times where I will use it as well, and I will actually look and find shots that I didn't necessarily anticipate that I was going to get, just because it gave me that extra frames per second. So if you're shooting sports photography and you want to look at our lineup, we have about 10 cameras in our lineup right now. If you can afford it, the place where I would probably start is a D7500. And that's because the D7500 can shoot at 8 frames per second, which when I started at Nikon, that was our fastest sports camera. I think the D2X only shot at 8 frames per second, okay? And that was our $6,000 camera at the time. And that's what all sports shooters were using. Now you can get that in as low as a D7500, 8 frames per second, blasting away all these raw files, 21 megapixel. Okay, so that's where I would start from a D7500 standpoint. Now, D7500 is interesting because it does have a pop-up flash. Usually if I shoot with sports, I'm using a D5, D850, or D500, which doesn't have a pop-up flash. So my question to you guys is, flash in sports photography, yes or no? All right, it depends. I see some no's, shaking no's. I see some people that don't want to answer, but ordinarily, I would say no, okay, because the flash, if you're using a telephoto lens, simply will not reach where you're going. And a lot of times I'm at the Blue Jay games and I see people, they will have a legitimate kit in their hand and there will be the pop-up flash ejected, okay? And they'll be shooting pictures. It will work against you because it's trying to synchronize with the flash. It probably will make your picture darker. So again, the sports mode on some of these entry-level cameras, D3500, D5300, is the way to go because it doesn't use the flash, okay? But you said it depends, and you know what? If you're taking sports, okay, such as this skateboarder right here, again, my friend in Vancouver, Rob, took this. He wanted to utilize his speed lights, so he could stop action with the speed lights with high-speed sync, but the problem is he's working in broad daylight, or even just taking a picture of the sports the athlete here. With our speed lights, you can do it in high-speed sync, and he's even using off-camera flash here. So I just wanted to show you that, taking pictures of sports, a lot of times it's the behind-the-scenes shots that are cool too, getting a little bit more intimate with the athlete outside of their sport. You take these behind-the-scenes shots. So think about that too when you're collaborating your portfolio for your particular sports photography. And those behind-the-scenes shots are pretty cool. Now, since we're in winter right now, I will address our favorite winter sport here in Canada, hockey, okay? My kids play hockey, whether your kids play indoor ball hockey, lacrosse, anything in an arena, this should apply to you. Problem with hockey is that the boards are there. I don't have to tell you the problems with that. They're usually puck-riddled with the smearing of the puck. They're usually very dull, and you take your $700 lens, and it's now reduced to a very poor quality, which is why a lot of times in arenas, I will go above the boards. So a lot of these, we're blessed in Canada. We have almost every community has these very, very beautiful arenas, okay? And a lot of times the seating will go above the boards. So I'll actually go there, and since I like the image quality that I get above the boards, much more so than shooting behind it, I tend to go above the boards and shoot from there. The problem is that you're shooting down, okay? Which is good in some cases, okay? But I find that when I'm shooting there, my son's never actually looking at the camera, and I can never actually see his eyes, okay? So, you know, as photographers here, as some of you are parents, don't be afraid. We're talking about amateur sports. Just get on the bench. Get on ice level, okay? I guarantee you 95% of the coaches will let you shoot from behind the bench, okay? It shouldn't be a problem, okay? Sign a waiver, wear a helmet, whatever. It's the pictures that are important, right? Not your health. So you want to make sure that you get the pictures, okay? And by doing so, you get better expressions on their faces. This is what I found through my years of photographing hockey. I can now get my eyes, my son's eyes when he's skating, and also anticipate the direction that he's going. So there'll be a lot of times where he's skating down the ice, okay? And you know how it is in hockey? All the parents get on the side of their team, and then they just divide down the red line, and then you never get on the opposing side's team. Usually, I'm actually on the other side because they're skating towards the opposing team. So I want to get them as they're coming towards the camera. So don't fall into that trap of sitting with the same parents of your team. Go to where the composition is, okay? And walk around that arena. Feel free to change your positioning because you're wielding around the big lens, okay? You came there for a reason. Make sure you get the composition that you want, and you'll go home much more satisfied with your shots, okay? 4 years ago now, actually, it was 2015. You guys remember what we had in 2015, the big sporting event here in Canada? It was the Pan Am Games, okay, down all over here in Ontario. I actually had the opportunity to shoot those Pan Am Games, and it got me out of my comfort zone because I usually shoot the sports that my children shoot, right? And it got me just to shoot sports that I never had access to or even had any knowledge about, such as handball, okay? Handball was a really interesting sport because the dynamism, the energy that they had in that sport, it was beyond anything that I had ever seen before. And the fact that they were doing these flying throws almost every pass gave me such incredible picture opportunities. So when I'm capturing shots like these, again, I'm anticipating the peak of action, okay? And I'm, you know, trying to figure out what would make a good shot. And generally, after observing the play for a while, I can kind of figure it out. It's, you know, similar to most sports. You're going one way, going the other. But a lot of you might be thinking, okay, what focusing mode should I be using here? And for a good time, I have, you know, a lot of people will play it safe and they will use single point, okay? Single point is very simple, but it's also very dangerous because you run the very real risk of having your little bitty point go away from your main subject and shooting on the background. So what I would suggest to you when shooting sports like this, where the subject takes a small portion of the frame, that you expand your net. So on your cameras, if you have, say, a D7000 series or above, you may have a dynamic AF modes. So that'll expand your net from 1 point to maybe 9 points, 21 points, 51 points, or it might be 72 points or 153 points, depending on the model that you have now. The newer models have very many points, but the perimeter is generally the same. It's just you're focusing with one square, but if your subject leaves that square, as long as it's within the net of that perimeter on your autofocus array, it should keep it in focus. Okay, so that's the beauty of dynamic focus. I also use something called 3D tracking, and that's actually the individual focus point following your subject around the frame, okay? So if your camera has that, or if you haven't experimented with it, go to AFC. These are only available in AFC, so don't bother looking in AFS for these modes. 3D tracking, dynamic tracking, they're all in AFC, and it'll allow you to track your subjects as they move around the frame, and they do it very easily too, because it tracks color, okay? So it's not just tracking contrast, it's also tracking color. That's why 3D tracking is so effective, and Nikon's come out with that since 2007. They've really perfected it in their latest round of SLRs. Now, can anyone cite me this saying here? I don't like sand. It's hard, it's coarse, and it gets everywhere. It's Clone Wars, Episode 2, Star Wars, and that was Hayden Christensen. He doesn't like sand. I don't like sand either, but I do like beach volleyball, okay? Because there's a lot of action in beach volleyball. And I never actually play this game, but when I was at Pan Am, I really learned to appreciate it from a photography perspective because there was a lot of action, and I love taking pictures in broad daylight because the images are so clean. I'm usually shooting within arenas, and I have to crank up the ISO to 25,000, and then I have to tweak the contrast to disguise the noise. What I love about sports like beach volleyball, for example, is that I can shoot at literally 100 ISO. And I happen to have a 70 to 200 2.8 on the sidelines shooting these. And because certain sports like tennis, like beach volleyball, you can, if you're shooting it like you're the assigned photographer or whatever, you can get very close to the action. Sometimes 300 is too much, so a lot of times I might be even throttling it down to between 70 to 200. So a lot of people, a lot of their photographers' staple in their bag is 70 to 200, and you will find the 2.8 is the magic number because that essentially will quadruple your shutter speed from a 70 to 300 5.6 to a 70 to 200 2.8. You can move from 1/500th of a second if you were at 5.6 to 1/2000th of a second at 2.8, okay? So the benefit there is you're quadrupling shutter speed. Like if you're shooting at 1,000th of a second, you can now shoot at 1/4000th of a second, okay? So that's really what you're getting when you buy a 2.8 lens, okay? It's a very expensive lens. It's bigger and heavier. It's not as actually far as a 70 to 300, but what you're getting is the ability to stop action is really what you want to do in sports. So you can get those moments where the ball essentially seems frozen and things like this. And again, get those dynamic shots. And one of the things that I like, again, about shooting these sports is the level of customization that I have in the camera. Now look at these two shots here. This one here is on the left-hand side. It's actually very easy to get because there's no obstruction to it. The one on the right-hand side is actually very difficult to get because it's behind a net. So you gotta prevent your camera from focusing on the net. The great thing about the more sophisticated Nikon focusing systems, such as 3D tracking, is that it will recognize the color of your subject. So even if they go up behind the net, it's still tracking them, okay? My colleague Chris takes a lot of volleyball shots, and if you're finding that you're shooting through obstructions like nets or fences or things like that, the color tracking of 3D tracking works very, very well, okay? Now, I'm going to show this next shot for you. It might seem a little bit cheeky, but I show this shot here just to show why am I positioned behind them, okay? Behind the player. It doesn't make any sense. I do that specifically because I was tracking the Canadian player in this case. And I know that after a play, they're going to turn around and look at the photographer, okay? So I actually position myself behind the action because if I have to take a photo of them from behind Team Cuba, I'm going to be taking a picture of them through the net, okay? So if I want to get a couple of shots of the athlete unobstructed, I might, do what might be counterintuitive is position myself in a position where I know that they're going to angle themselves towards the camera at some point, whether they're high-fiving their teammate or celebrating a win or whatever, okay? And lastly, I'm talking about all these telephoto lenses. There are times where I just, like I said before, I switch it out and use a wide-angle lens because they could be playing an audience of 2 people here, okay? You don't know, but you got a wide-angle lens, so shoot a little bit wider so you can see the audience, you can get a feeling of your environment. And that's a lot of what sports is. It's capturing the environment, okay? This past fall, my son wanted to join the football team, grade 10 high school football team. And my brain said, okay, so there's fees, that's not a big deal, but there's injury, okay? There's extra practice, and there's reduction in homework, and there's gonna be some potential for, you know, bad things. And then the other part of my brain thought, really good photos. So I said, okay, sign up. But the thing, again, I liked about football is, again, it's a really dynamic sport, but you are very far from the action, okay? So taking pictures of soccer, taking pictures of football, it's an enormous field. And you will really want to have 400 millimeters, to tell you the truth, because they could be at not even the width of the field, but the length of the field, okay? So that's why shooting things like a DX format makes sense, okay? Because to buy a 400, 500 millimeter lens, you're spending $12,000, $14,000 for a full frame. Whereas with a DX format, you can get a 70 to 300, and really you're shooting at 450, okay? And I could do this all day long without having to crop, okay? So again, the things I like about football is just that there is so much action, so much combat, you know, and again, what I would suggest for you to do is, as the plays are moving, okay, like in football, it's always moving down the field, move down the field with them, okay? Don't just get stuck in one spot, because ultimately they're going to be coming at you. So similarly with hockey, I go to where the action is going to be, not where my seat is warm, okay? And that's easy enough to do when you're shooting sports. You just want to find a place to get comfortable. But literally in football, I'm moving almost as much as the players. As soon as there's a first down, I'm moving down the field, because I want to get shots like these where I have a good vantage point of the action, okay? Again, things where the play is coming at you, you know that they're going to be run off the field to the sidelines, so be there to capture it. Be there to when they get tackled and things like that, okay? So I'm just about to wrap it up, okay, because I'm pretty much almost out of time here. But I did want to talk about a couple of accessories for sports photography, and especially if you're shooting outdoors. So such as when I was shooting my son's football games and such like that, it's not always in the best weather. So what I would recommend is protecting your investment, even though a lot of these cameras we buy nowadays are weather sealed, and literally they are weather sealed. I mean, I didn't mean to do this. I don't know why I did that. It's just, they are really, literally weather sealed, but you also want to play it safe by making sure that your water damage is not coming onto the lens or anything like that. Okay, so I cover my super telephoto lenses with a cover. Okay, you can, if you wanted to take a garbage bag, you could literally wrap your lens and camera in a garbage bag and just cut it out. I happen to have a Nikon one here. And also what I like to do as well is I need to keep my fingers warm. So I have these Valerie gloves here. And the cool thing about these gloves is that the fingers come out, okay? Because it's a real touch and feel. That's my aperture, that's my shutter, you know, that's my autofocus points. And even a lot of pairs of gloves might only have the right side available. I like these gloves because both sides are available. And for me, it's a lot of touch and feel with that zoom ring. I like to feel the exact point where I'm zooming in and out, and I know I need that, okay? So I like to have those gloves. So that's my spiel on our sports photography presentation. I do want to plug our YouTube site because we do have other content up there that relates to actually sports photography. We did something like that on Nikon TV and other things like the 180 to 400, our new Z cameras, etc., etc. So check that out. We've actually neatly divided it into playlists so you can see whatever appeals to you. Okay? We'll open it up to some questions right now for you guys if you have any questions. Yes, sir?
JPEG or RAW?
I shoot in RAW and JPEG. Okay? I get the best of both worlds. Why do I shoot in RAW and JPEG? I shoot in RAW as safety because I want to be able to adjust the exposure, white balance later on, and RAW does that in a way more forgiving way than JPEG. However, the reason I shoot JPEG is if I nail the shot in camera, it looks exactly in camera as it does on my computer. And I really like the way that Nikon in their cameras interprets color. It interprets noise. I don't think I can replicate that as good as the Nikon camera can. I've tried. I've gotten a bare raw file, brought it into Lightroom or Photoshop and tried to tweak around with my colors and things like that. I'm not satisfied with the way that I do it. I actually like the way that Nikon interprets the colors and the saturation and the contrast and the noise and things like this. It does a good job, way better than I can do with Photoshop or Lightroom, okay? And I'm okay with Photoshop and Lightroom, but the way Nikon does it is so much better, okay? So I shoot RAW and JPEG. And now you have so much customability to customize all those little settings through picture controls, okay? So that's why I shoot RAW and JPEG. It takes up a lot of space, but I don't care. The space is cheap. If you're detracted by the space that RAW takes, throttle your RAW files down to 12-bit compressed, okay? I do it all the time. I don't even shoot 14-bit uncompressed. I shoot 12-bit compressed, and I'm totally fine with those files. A couple more questions before we do our draw. Anybody? No? You're good? Okay, cool. So I think we'll wrap up here, guys, and thank you so much for joining us. Again, we'll see you next time on our Learn and Explore series. Thank you.